regard to research experience, again, that started in 1983. My areas of research have been primarily related to what are the effects of child abuse, either sexual abuse or physical abuse, on a child, and secondarily, what are the strategies that we can adopt to ameliorate or alleviate a lot of the problems kids have. What happens with the kids psychologically, or who's been abused, and probably over the last 8 years, what can we do to return them to as best mental health state as we can. So to alleviate mental health states they have incurred as a result of their abuses.
Can you tell the jury if you've authored papers related to the subject matter or closely related?
Yes, I have.
Can you give us a ballpark? How many or what topics have you covered?
Articles that have been published, I don't really keep track. I'd estimate maybe 35 or so of presentations, probably a few hundred presentations at conferences or workshops over the last 20 years.
Can you give me a little insight into what kinds of groups you've presented to over the years?
Sure. The American Psychological Association, the American Society on the Abuse of Children, the California Department of Education, numerous community child abuse prevention organizations, or national child abuse prevention organizations. There's an international society on the abuse of children. I've presented for them in several countries. The National Institute of Mental Health, the Center for Disease Control, the National Science Foundation. There's a few others, but those are some of the primary organizations that I've presented to.
Okay. Have you had occasion to produce any types of professional videos?
Yes, I have.
And can you tell me a little bit about that?
Again, I think I said earlier that probably around 8 years ago, I started shifting from what are the effects of abuse to how can we treat children who have been abused. And there's part of that developed and adapted a child treatment program, and currently involved in disseminating, training other organizations how to use that program, and concurrent with that has been the development of about 5 training videos. I say about because we're still working on one. Currently, I think there are 3 that are English, 2 in Spanish, and we're just finishing up the 3rd one in Spanish.
And can you describe for the jury any honors you've received?
I've received honors for work that I've done related to child abuse from the American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children. I used to be one of the board of directors and now advisory board from the Department of Education for the Danforth Compton Fellowship. It's a national program related to ethnic minorities who achieve academic excellence and a few others.
And have you had occasion to receive various grants?
Grants, I have.
Can you give me an estimate of the total dollar amount of grants that you've obtained?
I don't think I can do that other than it's a few $1 million, but I couldn't tell you how many, exactly how much.
Okay. Do you serve on any advisory boards?
I do.
Can you just name a few?
APSAC, American Professional Society on the Abuse of Children, California Department of Social Services, California Department of Social Services related specifically to adoptions. I'm currently in Sacramento County on the advisory board for the Department of Mental Health, Sacramento County Department of Mental Health, and also the Victims Compensation Program, which essentially oversees a large amount of mental health services throughout the state of California, providing funds for children who have a history of being abused and neglected.
Can you describe any affiliations that you hold, professional affiliations?
APSAC, there are a few others. The international version of, not APSAC, but there's a CAPSAC, which is the state version of APSAC. There's the International Child Abuse Organization, and again, a couple of others, but I don't have a copy of my CV in front of me, so my memory might not be complete.
Okay, are you familiar with a theory called child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome?
I am.
Can you describe how it's that you're familiar with that concept?
My recollection is that I read that article when it was first published in 1983. The purpose of that article is to provide a description of what commonly occurs with a child who has been sexually abused. So since that time, I've been involved in training related to teaching people about what happens with kids who've been sexually abused, and a lot of the foundational research that has gone into support the child abuse accommodation syndrome. I currently teach psychology interns and social work interns about sexual abuse by explaining child abuse accommodation syndrome.
And in the 1,000 or so kids that you've personally treated, have you had occasion to utilize the theories of child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome?
Yes, I have. The child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome is really developed to educate people, to inform them about what happens, and so I think that information that is contained within the accommodation syndrome has been very helpful to me, and something certainly I've seen repeatedly in children I've evaluated or treated. It is foundational to my understanding about what happens to kids who've been sexually abused.
Have you ever qualified in court in the state of California as an expert in the child sexual abuse accommodation syndrome?
I have.
And how many times have you so qualified?
Maybe 80, 85 times would be my estimate, including in the Michael Jackson case.
And have you ever qualified as an expert in child sexual abuse?
Yes. I've testified a few hundred times in juvenile court where I've been asked by the judge to address a specific issue, often to evaluate either a child or an adult, and then to report back to the court.
Your Honor, I'd offer Dr. Urqueza as an expert in child abuse accommodation syndrome and child sexual abuse.
He's accepted as an expert.
Dr. Urqueza, what is CSAAS?
That phrase comes from the title in an article by Dr. Summit. The purpose of that article was to specifically, for people who would be doing therapy with children who had been sexually abused, and the purpose was to educate them, to dispel any misunderstandings or distortions or misperceptions that they had about what commonly occurred with a child who had been sexually abused, and to provide them with a framework to understand what the research said about what happened with sexual abuse. It's still being used for that same purpose.
Can you talk about some of the myths or understandings that it's directed towards dispelling?
Yes. One of the myths was, we know that very few children are sexually abused by a stranger. Sometimes it happens, but most children are sexually abused by someone with whom they have an ongoing relationship with. One of the misperceptions, if a child is sexually abused, she'll run and tell mommy, daddy, teacher. Again, we know from research, sometimes it happens, but it is much more typical for there to be some strategy placed upon the child to be quiet, sometimes throughout their whole childhood.